global leader in the critical mineral space and best confront the challenges created by an expected scarcity of reliable supplies of critical minerals, all framed in terms of the climate crisis, national security, and geopolitical competition. Over the course of a year and a half, we held a number of roundtables across the country, as well as individual meetings, and have more than 60 leaders from across industries, sectors represented in these discussions. So today we're here to discuss the findings and recommendations in this report and to talk about how to take them from paper into reality. We're grateful for the support of the funders of this effort, the Hewlett Foundation and ClearPath, and for the leadership of our two co-chairs of this effort, who I'm going to invite to the stage now. Megan O'Sullivan, who's the incoming director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and also the Jean Kirkpatrick Professor of Practice of International Affairs at Harvard University Kennedy School. And Professor Jason Bordoff, who's the founding director for the Center of Global Energy Policy and the Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. So welcome, Jason and Megan, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and good afternoon. Critical minerals have catapulted from being an obscure term to something just shy of a household phrase in just a few short years. And we know why this has happened. It's pretty clear because of the increasing urgency around the energy transition and the role that critical minerals will play in that transition. And also because of the context of the increasing competition between the United States and China's dominant role in many critical mineral supply chains. So I was delighted, Jason was delighted when the Aspen Institute reached out to us about 18 months ago and said that they wanted to do a task force on this very important issue. And as Greg mentioned, over the last 18 months, we've convened several meetings, have had a wide range of consultations. And all the while, from the beginning, we're cognizant that we were injecting ourselves into a dynamic landscape. We know that a lot has happened on this front. We know a lot of people are thinking about this, producing reports, ideas, and even in the time frame in which we were meeting, Congress passed a significant piece of new legislation that had real consequences for this critical mineral challenge. So our effort today is, in releasing this report, is to complement the work that's ongoing, to try to add our voice to those that are really calling for increased urgency tackling these issues. And most importantly, to offer some actions that we believe could have bipartisan support and that Congress could actively work on in order to advance the objectives we outline in the report. So as befits a task force that is on a complex matter with many, many different stakeholders, we did many consultations during this task force. We spoke with former members of Congress, with investors, with national security experts, with indigenous and tribal leaders, with environmental NGOs, with the mining industry, with academics, with technologists, with the manufacturing industry, all seeking to get and capture their perspectives. And the result is what we believe is a comprehensive report that reflects the urgency and again has some clear steps which we think can garner bipartisan support or the support of a wide group of stakeholders. So you'll note in the task force report that we urge Congress to focus on two objectives. Very broadly speaking, the first is taking steps to address and increase production, both domestically and globally. And the second has to do with securing a responsible and resilient critical mineral supply chain. Now, then we propose a number of recommendations, and you'll note in the recommendations, there are domestic components to our recommendations and there are international components. And we really think the two of these have to come together in order to make a full strategy. So before I share some of the recommendations, I want to do two things. First is thank a number of people who are in this room, and there were many people who are really instrumental to this task force success. First, of course, is my co-chair, Jason Bordoff, who he and I do a great deal of work together, and it's always a pleasure, and it always makes me smarter. So thank you, Jason. And also, I want to thank the members of the task force, many of whom are in the room with us today, for their real dedication, for making an effort to fly to locations that may have not been convenient at the time and to engage in serious discussion. I'd also like to thank members of the Aspen Institute, Greg, who we just heard from, who runs the Environmental and Energy Program, Tim Mason, who was really the mastermind behind the task force. He conceived it and was the consistent driver. RJ Johnston, who you'll hear from later today, who we really couldn't have done this without his deep expertise, his writing, and his leadership and his close contacts with many affected in this community. And Sina Vizier, who is also here, looking for him in the audience, modestly sitting in the back, who really did a great deal to bring a lot of disparate views together in a coherent sense. And also we had a number of others, Dan Propp, Lily Lee, Francesca Resnick, and Tanzia Reddy, who really helped in the production of this task force. So again, I'm going to come back up and share a couple of recommendations, but the second thing I wanted to do after the thanks was to turn to Jason and have him discuss some of the findings, which were really the basis upon which we built our recommendations. So Jason, can I welcome you to the podium?
Good to see everyone here. Thanks very much. And I'll just echo Megan's thanks to everyone. That's maybe most important, especially Megan as my partner in many, many things in the writing we do and in chairing this task force. It's always a privilege to work with her, and I learn a huge amount. But everyone she just mentioned can't be thanked enough. Greg and Tim and Francesca and Tanzia and the whole team at the Aspen Institute. I just came back from Paris, where we co-hosted the Aspen Columbia Global Energy Forum. And that's just one of many partnerships we have with the Aspen Institute, which does extraordinary work with a really fantastic team here. The Center on Global Energy Policy wouldn't run every day without RJ Johnston, our executive director, who not only brings a lot of leadership experience and management experience, but deep expertise, particularly in this topic. And as Megan said, Sina, Dan Propp, and Lily Lee, who work with me at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And in terms of how do we get this into the hands of the people who have the ability to do something about it, Andrew Gambiner, who leads our policy effort in Washington and all of our strategic communications, and his fantastic team, particularly Natalie Volk. So I just want to say thanks for really a team effort on this. As Megan said, I just wanted to spend a minute. Yeah, I'll step closer. I said nice things about people in case you didn't hear them. What I wanted to do was say a quick word about the findings. So we spent a lot of time studying the issue as a task force to figure out, what problem we were trying to solve. And I think we all know how urgent now the problem or the issues related to critical minerals are, but we spell those out in the report, an issue that holds immense importance for climate and for national security, that these critical minerals, whether it's lithium, cobalt, or graphite, or nickel, are essential for a wide range of technologies related to the energy transition, wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles. I think that's well known by this point, but the demand is going to skyrocket. You can't build an electrified economy without an enormous amount of copper. The IEA says demand for critical minerals will increase sixfold by 2050 in their net zero scenario. This is an enormous increase. It requires an enormous amount of investment, an enormous amount of increased mining activity, and there are potential consequences if we don't do that thoughtfully and carefully. The task force found that right now the United States is not well prepared for this growth. Our domestic production of critical minerals is far too small to meet the impending demand and has not yet shown the capacity to scale up at the rates that would be required for a clean energy transition at the speed and scale we need for targets like 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius warming. And for those critical minerals we source from abroad, geopolitical fragmentation and production concentration of supply chains threaten to undermine the US's ability to meet the needs of meeting the energy transition. And the consequences of failing to do something about this are really quite severe. Hence the call for action for Congress in particular. If we don't have the mineral inputs that we need for key technologies, our transition to clean energy is going to stumble. And it would hamstring our ability to manufacture technologies crucial to our national defense. So it's vital that America's economic, climate, and security interests are enhanced and made more secure by the government adopting a strategy that establishes a secure and resilient critical minerals supply chain. That's the purpose of this report, with a number of recommendations for Congress, and hopefully we call on Congress to act swiftly to implement the findings. The findings fall into four broad buckets. And the first, and this was a task force, as Megan said, of people from all stakeholder communities: finance, industry, policy, academia, civil society, NGOs, tribal and indigenous communities, and others. First, there are clear market failures in the critical minerals industry that provide a strong basis for targeted government intervention. So that's important to say. To be clear, there were a lot of private sector people in the meetings when we had these task force meetings. Private firms and market-based incentives do a lot of the work, right? The old adage for, say, oil and gas is true. The best response to high prices is high prices. And in response to those market signals, companies will make investments and they will develop more resources. As demand rises, prices rise, and markets respond, as well as developing new technologies to reduce our need for additional mining through substitution, the different battery chemistries, maybe better recycling techniques. We talked about all of those things. But the task force found markets alone don't do everything. They don't address the national security risks that come from excessive dependence on any one particular supplier, in this case, particularly China, where the vast majority of refining and processing capability for minerals is located. Markets alone don't expand mineral mining, refining, and processing at the scale and speed we need with adequate social, environmental, community, and indigenous protections. There is a role, a necessary and justified role, for government in how we develop our mineral resources. That was finding one. The second was emphasizing the environmental and social concerns related to critical minerals extraction and production. These are an essential ingredient to any policy response. And failing to address these concerns is not only going to harm communities and ecosystems, but it's going to jeopardize the ability to move as fast as we need to develop the resources that we need. And as Megan said, we had extensive discussion with local community leaders, tribal leaders, indigenous leaders, and others. Third, the United States alone cannot solve the critical minerals challenge. Any successful strategy has to work with partners around the world. There's a bunch of reforms in here about how to do more to develop our own domestic production capability. But even if we do all of those things, the task force found the United States will be unable to reach self-sufficiency for critical mineral mining and refining and processing in the timeframes and at the scale we need. I think this finding is important because, particularly after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a lot of discussion around phrases like independence or getting off of Chinese dependence. And the task force found numerous reasons why it is important to reduce dependence on China, why it is important to build up and increase our domestic supply chains. But the task force also found there's almost no plausible scenario where the US does not remain heavily dependent on imports for a sustained period of time, or where China does not still play a still significant, albeit potentially reduced, role in global supply chains for minerals. So what's necessary is to both move much faster to reduce dependence on China and on imports more broadly, but also reduce the risks of that dependence. And there are a number of recommendations about how to do that. That was third finding. And then finally, the fourth, that China's current dominance over the critical minerals market poses a threat to supply chain security. But any efforts to counterbalance this dominance need to be treated with nuance and discussed carefully and approached on a mineral by mineral basis, because they do look quite different and we can't lump all critical minerals together. So again, the task force found, what do I mean by that? The task force found that we had a lot of discussion about the need to be careful and precise in talking about what the risk is of excessive import dependence on China or on supply chain disruptions more broadly. and encourage policymakers to avoid sometimes oversimplified comparisons to other security risks, say the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s. The report goes on at some length to explain what the risks are from mineral import dependence, why those may be different than, say, the daily flow of fuel supplies itself. If oil supply is disrupted, our ability to move around today is impacted. Our ability to power our factories is immediately impacted. If there were a disruption to lithium supply or even battery or solar panel supplies, whether it was for geopolitical intentional reasons or because of a natural disaster or something else, there would be price spikes in those supply chains. There might be shortages and higher prices for new solar panels, delays in installation, delays in the ability to purchase an electric vehicle. It would not affect in the same way the ability to keep the lights on or move about and have effective transportation and drive our existing fleet today. So just a need to sort of think with a fair degree of caution about what problem we're trying to solve and not draw over simple comparison to sometimes to the way we've often thought about energy security over the years. Those are the 4 broad findings, and we have some thoughts on what to do about those things, and Megan's going to share those with you.
Our musical chairs continue. I will be relatively quick here. The recommendations, we have 11 specific recommendations laid out in the report. I'll just mention kind of 3 groupings of them that figured particularly prominently in our discussions and in the recommendations. And the first really has to do with addressing the anticipated gap or critical mineral shortfall in our own situation here in the United States. So this has a variety of components. Not surprising, the first one is permitting. And we, like many other groups, spent a lot of time talking about permitting. And the signatories to the report, we all agreed on the need for more reform, serious reform, addressing the permitting process in the United States, and appreciated the actions that Congress has taken and hope that this will continue to be a subject of real focus for Congress. But we wanted to be very specific about a few recommendations, so we advocate much in line with an earlier Aspen Institute task force on permitting. We talk about the need for more place-based permitting and the need for putting strict timelines around adjudication of certain projects. Alongside permitting, still in this whole idea of making it, addressing the domestic situation at home, we talked about demand. Too often we focus myopically on supply, but here participants were really adamant that we also need to focus on demand. In fact, if we're trying to address a shortfall, addressing supply and demand should really be in equal measure. And there, the report talks in some detail about supporting efforts to invest in new technologies to address substitutes, alternatives, and to recycle critical minerals. The second grouping of recommendation or major theme that came up was the just and equitable development of resources here in the United States. And from the beginning, the task force, the co-chairs, the members, and others involved really acknowledged that the issue of tribal and indigenous communities was very central to what we were doing, both for reasons in itself, having to do with justice and equity, and having to do with the past, which has been very detrimental to some of these groups, but also because we thought it was important if we are to try to address some of the challenges having to do with increasing mining in the United States. So as I said, we felt very strongly that this needed to be a focus of what we did, a particular focus, and it really shaped a lot of how we pursued our consultations. And this is laid out in the task force report, but we consulted with a wide range of federal government tribal policy experts. We spoke with Native American legal scholars and practitioners. We spoke with individuals and groups that had deep expertise on Indigenous reconciliation and issues related to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. We also made an effort to go visit certain places. We visited the Resolution Copper Mine in Arizona. We met with a wide range of stakeholders while we were in Arizona. We engaged with journalists and took tours of the Oak Flats area. We consulted with Canadian tribal leaders on new models of equity participation that have shown so much promise in Canada. So with that, we felt like it was important to highlight this, but we also wanted to make some very tangible recommendations. And again, acknowledging that at the end of the day, it will be tribal leaders and Indigenous communities that will be best situated to advocate for themselves, and that this will be done on a project-by-project basis. But there were two specific recommendations that the report holds, which I would draw your attention to. The first has to do with the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. And as many of you know, there has been a lot of confusion and a long history around that concept. And it was one that we discussed in great depth in the task force. And in the report, we urge Congress to clarify the concept of FPIC and where it will apply. And the report advocates that it should be made clear that consent should be from directly impacted tribal nations. And this consent will be an essential prerequisite for critical minerals development. Second, we recommend in the report that Congress invests in and creates opportunities for tribal nations to have equity investments in critical minerals developments. And not only by helping ensure that this would be the case, but also by helping provide financing so that tribal nations that have interest in doing so have the resources to do so. So the third and the last grouping of recommendations I wanted to highlight has to do with the international scene. And it's not a coincidence that our findings and our recommendations are much in line. That's how we wanted it to be. And this whole point that Jason made about understanding that even under the best circumstances, the United States will not be able to meet all of its needs by itself. And so we urge Congress not to become too enamored with the Buy American provisions. And instead, we urge Congress to really focus on working with friends and allies and other partners around the world to agree on a common set of clearly defined environmental, social, and governance standards for the production and processing of minerals. And we say that those standards are important to have agreement on and to have a wide set of agreements on, but that those standards shouldn't stand alone. They should be the opening the door or the prerequisite for additional support for mining in places that actually sign up and adhere to these standards. And we talk in the report about finance for projects that are under jurisdictions that adhere to these standards. And we also urge Congress to consider, and I know this is not popular in Washington, but to consider the need for trade agreements with countries that are willing to sign up to these standards. To have this kind of high standard mining should come with financial support where possible, but also that these countries, in order to make such investments, will also feel much more confident in doing so if there are opportunities for them to take advantage of American markets when they do produce these minerals. So I'll stop there, but I'll say one last thing before turning it over to RJ and to members of our task force who have joined us today. The last thing I would say is, although we are very proud of this report and all that has gone into it, we acknowledge that this is not one and done. This is not the end of the show here. This is a rapidly evolving landscape in a very dynamic situation. These are steps that we're suggesting Congress consider very seriously, but that won't, even if Congress adopts all tomorrow, this won't mean that there won't be a need to reevaluate these recommendations and reevaluate the actions that are required on the part of the US government and other entities in order to meet this critical challenge. So with that, I want to once again, I don't need to introduce RJ again, but thank him, invite him onto stage, and I know he will introduce our task force members and our panelists who are really pleased to join us today. Thank you.
Great, I assume you want me up here on the stage, so I'll go right ahead. Thanks very much. I can invite my fellow panelists to come on up and sit anywhere you like. So I'm Robert Johnston, Executive Director at Columbia's steps are very advisable. Safety first. Did we? Okay, well, I would just say we didn't do a safety moment here for mining people. That's a no. Yeah, so I'm Robert Johnston. I'm the executive director, Center on Coal Energy Policy at Columbia SEPA in New York, and really excited to be here and grateful to Jason and Megan for bringing me in, and Tim and Greg and the great team here at Aspen for moving forward on this project. It was an 18-month project. It was very thorough, and yet, as Megan said, I feel like we still barely scratched the surface on a number of issues. I do want to thank everybody who came to the workshops and contributed to ideas and introductions and technical expertise. And it was really an interdisciplinary group. We certainly had policy people, former legislators, regulators. We had industry, we had NGOs, we had tribal representatives, we had finance, we had NGOs, so many different perspectives. Makes for a rich report. And I think we have some of that here in this panel today as well. I think all three of these folks need no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Senator Heidi Heitkamp was the U.S. Senator from North Dakota, 2013 to 2019, well known for her bipartisan views and expertise on energy and natural resources, which we miss very much. But fortunately, we still get access to your expertise through your work at the University of Chicago and CNBC and other places. Rich Powell, the CEO of ClearPath, one of the most innovative and sort of fast-charging think tanks here in Washington, looking at innovative approaches to the energy transition. And then Melanie Kenderdine, who needs no introduction as well, one of the co-founders and leaders of the Energy Future Initiative, veteran of the Department of Energy and MIT's Energy Future Initiative as well. So the idea here is to have a discussion for the next 30 minutes or so. I'll start with a few questions to get the conversation going, and we'll see where we can go with this. And I do want to pick up on where Jason and Megan left off. Senator, if I could start with you, and maybe a bit of a bold direction here, maybe go right into the politics versus policy, if I may. Because I think one of the things that's intriguing me about this topic around U.S. critical minerals policy is there actually a consensus here? Is this becoming a more bipartisan issue, where between the China issues, the job creation issues, the energy transition issues, that you've got some kind of consensus where maybe the two parties can work together on this issue? Or is this going to get kind of caught up in the same meat grinder as everything else? What's your take on that?
I think there is a growing consensus in this country that climate is a problem. And I think that's becoming bipartisan. And so, I work a lot in the agricultural area where, if 10 years ago you wanted to talk about climate at the Farm Bureau, let me tell you, you get drummed out of the room. Now, if you want to talk about it, they want to know what that means for how they're producing. They want to know whether that means that there's going to be an additional income stream if they, in fact, embed carbon in the soils. And so we're seeing a sea change in terms of the necessity of doing something. That has elevated the interest in how you get from A to B. Now, there is no consensus on how rapid this transition can take place. And I think that's the difference, is timing. Because if you talk to maybe someone who is a staunch supporter of the Green New Deal, that transition looks possible in the next 10 years, right? All we have to do is quit drilling. All we have to do is quit producing natural gas, and that'll solve our problem, right? If you talk to someone on the other side, they say it will be centuries before we wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. And we have a complete energy transition. The importance of this report politically is that it's calibrating, right? We aren't here to make a political statement with this report. We're simply here to present the challenges. And there was an incredible group. And every time I joined this group, and I just want to say this to Aspen and to Jason and Megan, every time I came, I learned so much. And there's no way all of that great intellectual capacity that was in that room can be in one report. But yet we know that there are people out there thinking about this who can, Megan, as you said, take it to the next iteration. Think about what the next piece is. But politically, the importance of this report is it calibrates people's thinking with facts. It says, here's our challenge. Here's what it's going to take. When we talked about this in Miami at the Aspen meeting, I kind of said, okay, if you need to hit this climate target, what's plan B? Because we can't do it with what we have now in supply chain in terms of electrification. And so even if tomorrow we adopt every recommendation, the horizon, the event horizon for these changes is so great that it may not be the sole solution to the challenge of how we reach climate goals. And so I think what has changed, RJ, is the sense of, oh my God, we let the Chinese eat our lunch, and now we're going to pay for it. That's what's changed. And that's a very bipartisan thing in terms of, and I think that's why this report's so important, because it really talks about that you can't demonize and completely ignore the fact that this is a supply that is very heavily dependent on Chinese investment so far. And so now we've got a lot of people politically thinking about how can I be the most hawkish, the most aggressive against China. And that is, in fact, something that needs to be measured against the need to achieve climate goals. And so I think there will be people who will look at this in a very nuanced way that haven't seen it that way because of this report. And that's why I think the report is important politically.
I just personally love hearing terms like nuance and calibration. We don't hear that enough. That's good. And I think this is an issue that requires that. Rich, let me ask you a similar question about the politics of this. The report was laden with very specific recommendations. How do you see the politics around this unfolding as policymakers digest this report?
Well, the nuanced and calibrated approach we took, I'm happy to answer that. Let me just first echo Heidi and the thanks to Megan and Jason and really RJ, who led us through this. It's the entire Aspen team for creating this opportunity, and to Matt Malo and Career Path alumni Alex Fitzsimmons on our team who engaged deeply in this. It's fantastic to be up here with the senator and with Melanie. Melanie has forgotten more about critical minerals than I know about the topic, so it's I do think that there's tremendous bipartisan opportunity in this right now. I mean, frankly, if you start the conversation with, we'd like more mining to happen in the United States, we can probably find several hundred Republicans to support that legislation on the Hill. I do think that the practical, balanced approach that this report took does give it a greater chance for bipartisan uptake. Let me first say, if anyone wonders where Aspen reports go once they're published, they just go off and sit on the shelf to die. One of the major pillars of the Aspen Cleaner Faster dialogue, a similar process published now about 3 years ago, was just enacted into law as part of the bipartisan debt ceiling negotiations. So the administrative limits on the length of NEPA filings and administration was adopted into law as part of that. So that recommendation had real legs. We're going to get the other 3 pillars of that report done as well. But I was very glad to see that many of those things, which are quite bipartisan, were adopted as well here in the top recommendation, the permitting reform recommendation. I think that's a terrific place to start and quite a bipartisan place to start as we look at this. There are some harder things in this, right? So, as Megan mentioned earlier, the pre-clearance conversation, right? The place-based approach to this is a very challenging conversation. And if we are realistic about actually getting this done, it is an absolutely necessary and vital conversation. We simply cannot continue on business as usual with the existing NEPA and other environmental permitting process, especially when we have so many sites around the country that have effectively already been pre-cleared for this kind of activity, that have already been identified as brownfields, that have already gone through EISs and EAs for heavy industrial development on those sites. When those sites exist all around the country, why we would repeat those processes again just because it's a new critical minerals project wouldn't make any sense at all. We have to be thinking about old things like that. I also think that the research and development recommendations in this, the innovation recommendations, are quite bipartisan. So investing more in all of the advanced technologies, which would help us alleviate our critical minerals challenges, whether that's advanced recycling technologies. Melanie will, I'm sure, tell us all about why recycling is not enough, and we need to also find both new things and substitutions. But the substitutions are also incredibly important. Some folks may recently have read about Form Energy, for example, which is an iron air flow battery technology, which very notably is setting up a very great big new factory in West Virginia to make it, and is going to deploy across the upper Midwest. that's an entirely new battery chemistry that switched from critical minerals like lithium to earth abundant minerals like, well, air and iron, one of the most abundant minerals on the planet, right? So that's the kind of breakthrough we might see through further investments in innovation and substitution. I think that's also quite a bipartisan hook that would have quite a good uptake on the Hill from these recommendations.
Thank you, Rich. And Melanie, yes, I'm going to ask you about recycling substitution. That's my second question for you. My first one is to pick up on what the senator was talking about vis-a-vis China, and your thoughts on, what Jason and Megan were talking about, the report discussed about how much can the U.S. and friends do on their own versus a more expansive approach, and who should we partner with? What are the risks of trying to do too much on our own, and who should we partner with?
Let me just say that, and I just returned, so I'm sleepy, from a trip to Sofia, Bulgaria, and Brussels, Belgium, talking there about the future of natural gas in a carbon constrained environment. And my response to both of the workshops we had there, it was what we need to be saying, I think, is that we are the #1 trading partner with China, and Europe is #2. Remind both ourselves and the Chinese that it's an ongoing relationship that is benefiting both parties. And so say that over and over again. Don't be so hostile to the Chinese and make them not hostile to us. I suspect some of those messages are being delivered in China by the Secretary of State. Having said that, the Chinese are very, very aggressively pursuing the metals and mineral supplies where they don't have them. I was giving a speech in Nairobi, Kenya, a few years ago. Go all the way to East Africa. I want to do something fun. So I decided I'd go see the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, and had to drive 3 hours from Kigali to the mountain gorillas. Every step van, every construction site, everything in Rwanda was written in Chinese. And went to Katowice, Poland, COP24, had dinner one night with somebody from Australia. The Chinese have bought all the Australian lithium mines. They're doing that in South America. And so they are aggressively, smartly pursuing some of the things that they know we're going to need. And so I think that we need to be very, very mindful of their activities. We need to be very mindful that we are a major customer of theirs. And at the same time, where we can, do what we can to meet some of the metals and minerals needs that we have for a clean energy transition. And we were just talking earlier in the green room. The first speech I gave on metals and minerals was in 2009. I've been focusing on this issue for a long, long time. That was more rare earths at that point in time, not looking at all the other issues that we have to deal with, but have loved the recommendations on the need for ongoing discussions with our allies and trading partners. Okay, I would up that to the G7, G20. Russia's a member of the G20. That's a problem. TPP, the reconfigured TPP, the quadrennial security dialogues, et cetera, et cetera. G7, G20. OECD. We need to up the profile of metals and minerals and develop strategic pathways for protecting the supply chains that we need. We are never going to have all of the supplies of metals and minerals that we need in the United States. And one thing I also have looked at is that I looked at the countries that have large volumes of metals and minerals that we need for our clean energy transition that we are not currently importing from today. And those countries that are not members of the OECD, G7, et cetera, and those I had to write them down so I would get them right. Bolivia, Chile, Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, Laos, Iran, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. And so where we can develop strong bilateral relationships on metals and minerals with those countries where we don't have overarching geostrategic entities that we are currently all members of. So just a few thoughts on that.
No, super helpful. Thank you, Melanie. Senator, let me come back to you and let's talk about this issue of communities. You represent a Western state and you have kind of firsthand on the ground experience with natural resource development. And let's face it, I mean, there's mistrust of the mining industry historically, certainly among tribal nations, many tribal nations, but also among other communities in the West. At the same time, the industry's done a lot differently over the last 10, 20, 30 years to rebuild that trust, looking at these two big issues of how do you share benefits and how do you manage environmental impact. You know, where do you think we are in this question of trust and what would help improve things?
I think that the question is, how likely is it that we can hit a reset button, especially with the indigenous populations? Because the history is not good. The history from the very beginning with colonization and leading to exploitation, you know, putting people on reservations, then leading to exploiting people when they're there. And when you find minerals, say, step aside. I mean, look at the Black Hills. Black Hills, no one had any interest in until they found gold and literally violated the Laramie Treaty. And, you know, people don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. And so what about today would tell anyone that it was going to be different tomorrow? We're currently trying to site a CO2 pipeline coming from ethanol plants into North Dakota. North Dakota has particularly good geology for injection of CO2. This is something I worked on, 45Q. It's now been expanded under the IRA. It's something that I spent a lot of time working on as a way to kind of figure out how we are going to make this transition and still maintain energy independence and affordability. And so, but that pipeline isn't being stopped by the federal government. That pipeline is being stopped by communities all along the path, and not by states. And so, and not by one political party or another political party. It's the most interesting collaboration in North Dakota of people who are opposing this CO2 pipeline. And I'll bring that up because it's not part of the critical minerals discussion, but it is part of autonomy, subnational tribal autonomy. And we've got to have a realistic conversation about the societal impacts of this transition, whether it is lost jobs, and that's something RJ and I have spent a lot of time talking about. How do you convince a Boilermaker to support new climate policies when all they see is a lost $140,000 a year job? And somebody says, oh, go make solar panels. They say, I don't see a solar panel factory anywhere in my neighborhood. And oh, by the way, that's a $40,000 a year job. And so we've got to have that conversation if we're realistically going to develop the resources in this country. Because guess what? That's where the minerals are. And we haven't talked about, even if you extract the ore, the process of processing this is where the environmental impact frequently is. One of my first jobs was working at EPA. No, it shocks people that sometimes that I was an environmental lawyer, but I worked in Region 8, where literally in a gold mine, they had leachate ponds. Gold traditionally arrives with uranium, right? And they literally contaminated a whole water supply by basically flooding the ponds and overflow into water supply. So we haven't even talked about the environmental impacts, the historic environmental impacts. Go up to the range, and if you want to see a community in conflict, go to the Iron Range in Minnesota, where taconite is possible, and take a look at the fight between the communities that are supporting tourism. They don't want the mine. They think that it's going to affect tourism. It's going to affect their other economic opportunities. So how do we collectively in this country figure out how we're going to create one policy? Well, I think we've gone a long way in this report to acknowledge the past, because you cannot fix this without acknowledgement of the past and reparations for the past. That's the dirty little secret here. And the second thing that you have to do is you have to build trust. And I think that's where this report was so sensitive about the need to have that prior consent, the need to acknowledge it, put the flag down. And so when you look at kind of the past, and people say, well, turn the page, hit the reset button, we're better guys now. Well, really? Are you? We've heard that before. And it hasn't worked for us. And so I think when we look, I love what you said about making sure that we're looking at new technologies, making sure that we aren't just saying, okay, we need you to give us this in order to achieve this goal. What is great about this issue, because we know how critical this is to achieving climate goals, is all of these communities, particularly environmental communities, in both permitting reform and on climate, realize that we have to do something on these issues that traditionally they have not supported. And it creates a real political opportunity, but it's not going to happen without trust.
Trust at the community level, especially. Rich, you looked at permitting reform from so many different angles, and obviously a mine is very different than a transmission line or a pipeline. And some of the things that the senator mentioned at the local level, that history of mistrust, that's sort of one issue specific to sort of permitting reform for mining. But how do you view mining within this permitting reform process? And what are the sort of specific unique challenges for mining versus some other types of energy you're looking at?
See, obviously a mine is very different. And I think some of the same just mental models and frameworks can be applied. It might imply different timelines or different base requirements and reviews than in other things which have less of a, less potential environmental problems with them. Obviously, a mine would be very different than, siting surface solar panels on public lands or something like that. But some of the same things. So first, on the pre-clearance side, or sort of the place-based side, in the same way that in the energy space, many of us have advocated for looking at places like designated energy communities, designated brownfield sites, places that are being redeveloped from other sources as places where you could accelerate or even pre-clear certain kinds of projects. We think similar sorts of approaches are warranted here. I think the way that the recommendations in this report came down on that were, rather than complete pre-clearance, so automatic permitting or a categorical exclusion in the parlance of NEPA, for any NEPA nerds out there. I think what the report instead says is give the lead agency a 90-day deadline with a presumption of approval in those specific types of sites. And I think that that's the right way to adjust that mental model of pre-clearance or place-based in the context of mines, which are much more complicated in local environmental impacts. Similarly, for the adjudication after the fact, we can certainly look at all kinds of other areas of extreme national security concern. So defense procurement, for example. Disputes over defense procurement need to be adjudicated in 100 days or less, right? And if we give that timeline to courts, if we give that timeline to administrative law judges, they can do a proper adjudication over a dispute like that in 100 days, in 3 months. We could set similar timelines at adjudication. It does not mean we're taking away anybody's right to adjudicate, to challenge the decisions. It simply means that the process of making that decision has to be done in a much faster timeline. And the last thing I'll say, just a note, and we mentioned this in the report and in the recommendations, but just a reminder, place-based solutions, pre-clearance solutions, these do not mean that the standards, that the environmental standards go away. It simply means that the upfront permitting process to effectively prove that you're going to comply in advance is limited in some way, but you still have to comply. So you are still going to be audited. You are still going to be fined. You are still going to be shut down if you're not complying with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and everything else we might be concerned about. I think people often hear streamlining or place-based or something, and they say, well, the environmental compliance is going away. It is not. It's simply the way that we ensure that compliance is shifting so that we actually have a realistic chance of getting enough of these things in the ground here in the US.
Great, thank you, Rich. And Melanie, I promise to come back to you on recycling and substitution innovation side of this. You have so much background in that area. That was obviously a key element of the discussion in the report and the recommendations. There's a lot more public dollars going into those spaces, more private sector dollars, venture capital. How should we think about the potential of recycling and substitution and innovation as a solution to these critical mineral supply chain challenges versus sort of the greenfield mining side?
Let me just say that on recycling, and I've spent a lot, there are environmental issues with recycling itself, okay? We have to resolve those. There's combustion, there's collection, there's all sorts of issues that are associated with recycling. But I think it's very important. And as the report says, 10% of the materials you need for, actually it's an IEA number, I believe, but in the report, the materials you need for batteries are you can get from recycling by 2040, I think is. And 10% doesn't sound huge, but it could be very substantial. But I've also been looking at what we can do to create incentives for a huge transition. It's not just a transition. I'm from New Mexico, very worried about Native Americans, obviously, in New Mexico. And the mining industry in New Mexico and across the country has a very, very poor track record, okay, and created a lot of problems for Native peoples. But another problem that I've been looking at, number one center of commerce in small towns in rural America, auto repair. Auto repair. Electric vehicles are a threat to those centers of commerce in small towns in rural America. We need to provide them with incentives and alternatives to auto repair. And I look at a kind of a hub and spoke system for recycling batteries and a whole lot of other things. You can't just do it with batteries alone, but a hub and spoke system for recycling a lot of different products, looking at that as a potential replacement for some of the commerce in small towns in rural areas, making them collection points or recycling centers or whatever, so that we can replace the jobs that threaten their livelihoods. And I say one other thing, and this is really just about jobs and supply chains. I know DOE did 13 supply chain studies, a generic one and 12 technologies. None of those supply chains drove the issues to ground about what it means in terms of jobs and what it means in terms of manufacturing facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I just give you an example, and this is a reference frame I did, not reality, but close. Looking at the number of transmission towers we need for high voltage transmission and to build out the system that consistent with Princeton net zero analysis. And looking at the number of towers that you need, the number of miles, et cetera, by 2030, we will need 360,000 high voltage transmission towers alone. Those are made with steel, aluminum, and copper. Okay, but so are cell towers, and so are EVs, and so are EV charging stations, and so are the wires in the electric transmission. All of those materials, metals, and minerals that we're talking about, we need to translate those things into jobs, into imports, into demand for critical metals and minerals, and get real about what we can do here, what we need to do with the rest of the world, and put pen to paper and translate those into actual facilities, mining facilities for copper, huge demand. Wind generation is the most copper intensive generation technology there is. And so need to start translating those into reality and sit down and do that. We have a partnership with the AFL-CIO. We're going to be working on that. So.
Great. Well, I could ask many, many more questions, but I'm actually turning it back to our co-chairs here. Jason, oh, please, yeah.
Just want to add one calibrating fact, just because I learned it today. I was on a call with Gary Dewar, former ambassador from Canada. He was the premier of Manitoba. Manitoba has a large extraction industry, as does many of the provinces in Canada. The Chinese have bought a mine in Manitoba. So if you're looking to the south and saying this is a challenge, you can look north and look at the challenge of Chinese investment.
Well, as a Canadian, I'm always glad to hear Manitoba brought the discussion here for sure. And I think the critical minerals aspect of Canada is quite important. Rich, you want to get one final word in here before I hand it back to Jason and Megan?
I feel like I've covered all the ground.
Okay, very good.
I want to say one other thing, and I love the focus on data in the report, the need for data. Besides translating this into facilities and volumes, actual volumes, et cetera, one other thing I think that we need in terms of data is and it's not highlighted in the report, metals and minerals have become an energy security issue. We're talking globally. The lifespan of the clean energy technologies becomes an indicator of the draw on the metals and minerals. And I think that the lifespan, much more than approximately 15 years, blah, blah, blah. The lifespan needs to be the focus of a federal agency in getting accurate measurements of the lifespan of these technologies so that we can understand and more easily quantify the demand on metals and minerals.
Okay, very good. Well, thank Senator Hytkamp, Rich, and Melanie. I think we're going to stay here for now and hand it back to you guys.